Welcome to At Home with Music. This is Leon Olguin, and we're continuing our series on women composers. Today we're going to look at the life and work of Mélanie Bonis. Now, if you look at her name, you might be thinking it's pronounced Melanie, but most of the time I've heard it pronounced Mélanie. She was born on January 21st, 1858, and she passed away on March 18th, 1937. She was a French composer and could be considered part of the late Romantic period. She wrote more than 300 pieces. She wrote piano music, organ music, chamber music, choral music. She wrote a mass, and she wrote orchestral music. She also attended the Paris Conservatory, where her teachers included the famous composer César Franck. She was born to a lower middle-class family. Like many great composers, her talent became evident when she was very young, and she taught herself to play the piano. Now, as it often happens also with famous musicians, her parents didn't really want her to pursue music. But when she was 12 years old, her parents were persuaded by a professor at the conservatory, or the conservatoire, depending on how you want to pronounce it, to let her receive formal music lessons. And so, in 1874, when she was 16 years old, she began to study at the conservatory, and she took classes in accompaniment, where you learn how to play for a singer or an instrumentalist. She studied harmony, that is music theory. She studied composition, and she was actually there at the same time as the famous composer Claude Debussy. She also received some financial help from César Franck. Now, while she was at the conservatory, she fell in love with a fellow student. He was a poet, he was a singer, and his name was Amédée Louis Hedich. Now, her parents disapproved of this match and decided to take her out of the conservatory. In 1883, when she was 25 years old, they arranged for her to marry a businessman named Albert Dommage. He was 22 years older than Mélanie, and he was a widower. He had 5 children from a previous marriage. And so after this arranged marriage, she immersed herself in basically being a wife and a mother, and she actually bore him 3 children. It was not a great time for her because apparently her husband did not like music. Now, I can't imagine somebody not liking music, but apparently, according to some biographies of Mélanie Bonis, he didn't like music. In the 1890s, she met up again with Amédée Louis Hedich, the one whom she had fallen in love with back in during her time at the conservatory. By this time, he was a vocal teacher, he was a writer, he wrote about music, he was married to a Polish harpist, and he encouraged Mélanie to return to composition, and he was actually able to introduce her music to some of the publishers of the day. By then, her career started to take off, but this almost sounds a little bit like a soap opera. They had an affair, and this led to the birth of an illegitimate child. So at this point, she began to devote all her energies to composition, and in fact, her music was so good that when the famous French composer Saint-Saens heard it, he said, "I never imagined a woman could write music like this." And then some of her works were actually published. Now, it's interesting that they were published not under the name Mélanie, but under the name Mel. So maybe that fooled some people into thinking that these compositions were being written and published by somebody named Melvin. Now, there's a lot more that I could talk about concerning her private life, but let me just conclude by saying that Mélanie Bonis was a very modest woman, and she really wasn't much for self-promotion. And unfortunately, even at the time, those who admired her work could not overlook the fact that she was a woman. After the First World War, her music began to fall into obscurity. It wasn't performed very much, and eventually people forgot all about her. And then later on in her life, she suffered from arthritis, which confined her to bed. She continued to write music through the late 1920s, and then all the way until she died in 1937 when she was 79 years old. For many years, her music was overlooked and ignored, but recently it has begun to be rediscovered. And I'm somebody who has rediscovered her music, and I find it to be quite beautiful. She was very successful in her day. She was a contemporary of Claude Debussy. She was influenced by some of the famous composers of the day, and really she was one of the few women composers of her time who produced a significant body of published music. So I encourage you to search her out. I will include some links to other pieces of hers that you can find on YouTube, and I think you will enjoy her music very much. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And I look forward to our next installment as we continue to study the lives and work of women composers.